going to have a great talk about schizophrenia from Emily, RTA, who has had a lot of experience working with this group of people. So it's going to be great.
Thanks. Yes, I'm really excited to get to talk to you all today. So thanks for your time and attention. I'm going to turn this down just a teeny bit, I think. Okay. Okay, thanks for your patience. So yes, today I am going to talk about schizophrenia and schizophrenia spectrum disorders. And I want to spend a little minute on this title slide because it's actually really important that I included both schizophrenia and schizophrenia spectrum disorders as the topic of this lecture. Because as you may know, I know a few of you read about schizophrenia in your books for the most recent paper, so that was really cool. I know a lot of people have some background knowledge. As you may know, this disorder is extremely difficult to diagnose. And when I first learned about this back in 2010, when I first went to college and was taking general psychology and abnormal psychology, it was under the DSM-4. And so things looked a little different. And so then coming back to school some years later, learning more about the DSM-5, one of the things that really stands out to me is that we now view schizophrenia as part of a spectrum. And this is kind of the way the whole field is going. We're not just using these labels as a box to put people in and just give them a diagnosis and a label. We're viewing people more holistically on a spectrum of all kinds of disorders and symptoms. So I thought it was really important to point that out. The other thing I just wanted to begin with is some of the experience that I've had working with people with this disorder and my personal experience with how difficult it is to diagnose. So one of the things I do for the past couple years has been working on a study. We actually collaborate with UC Anschutz in Denver. And so we bring in participants, healthy controls, and participants with schizophrenia. And as part of our research study visit, we have to do a mini neurological interview. And so essentially that's the diagnostic interview that someone might experience if they go into a psychiatrist for a diagnosis. And my purpose in doing that is just to confirm that they have the diagnosis they said they do and that they fit in our criteria for the study. And so one of the most difficult things for me is figuring out exactly where they fall on this spectrum and whether that is someone who can be included in our study, which is schizophrenia and schizoaffective, or someone who has to be excluded, which is bipolar disorder with psychotic features and some other disorders that include psychotic features. And just from my experience from the past couple years, it's really difficult because people receive all different diagnoses throughout their lifetime. And so they might list off 7 or 8 diagnoses that they've had. And to try to pick apart in just 1 hour, typically, is the amount of time we have to do this, it's really difficult. Even by the nature of the disorder, you can imagine if you're experiencing hallucinations and delusions, it can be very difficult to know where that line of reality really is. Meeting someone for the first time and asking them all these questions, it has just become more and more apparent to me that more time and energy needs to be spent kind of getting to know people and where they're at and viewing them holistically and seeing which symptoms are actually having an effect on their quality of life. So that's some of my experience. I'm also working on an article right now that just got sent out to the editors, so that's kind of exciting. And that is about social determinants of health and how we measure them specifically when studying people with schizophrenia. And so social determinants of health can be anything environmental, qualities about the place that you live, where you work, just environmental features that can have an impact on your mental health. And so you'll kind of notice that that is something that I also focus on. So now the first thing that I want you to remember from this lecture is that schizophrenia is really difficult to diagnose and that it's best viewed on a spectrum. And so when you're reading literature about schizophrenia, make sure to take a moment to check in the methods. Were they including people with schizoaffective? Were they including all psychotic disorders? Was it a first episode schizophrenia? Because you might view the results and interpret them a little differently based on those inclusion factors. So something that may be useful as you're reading literature in the future. So today, these are the main questions that I hope to answer for you. We're going to talk a little bit of a review about defining schizophrenia and schizophrenia spectrum disorders. I expect that most of you know the basics, so if I do go a little fast over that, please forgive me. There will be references at the end that you can always go back to for more details. We'll talk about the genetic and environmental factors, which again, I'm sure you know a little bit about already, so I'm going to try and focus on some things you might not have heard before. My focus in schizophrenia is on the relationship between motivation and reward processing in cognition. And so since I figured you already know quite a lot about the dopamine hypothesis, how the neurotransmitters are being affected, I'm going to take it in this little bit more niche direction, try and fill in some information that maybe you haven't heard before. And then, of course, we'll talk about brain areas associated with those motivation deficits, and specifically how that might be useful in treating schizophrenia. So we're all familiar with the DSM-5. I just wanted to kind of throw it up there. Everyone is probably remembering right now, schizophrenia, you have positive symptoms, negative symptoms, cognitive symptoms. And one thing that I wanted to point out with this table is you can see the diagnoses on the left and then the associated features on the right, is that it's really about the extent of these psychotic features that kind of delineates between the different disorders. Specifically, schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, then you bring in that mood component. It starts looking a little more like bipolar. Of course, this becomes really difficult to diagnose because if you're experiencing hallucinations and delusions, you go into the hospital, your life is being turned upside down, you're probably going to have emotional components to that, even if it's not expressly mania and depression. So trying to figure out where that line is, the question that we often ask is, were your psychotic symptoms present 50% or more of the time that your mood symptoms were present? And I don't know about you, but even thinking about my own mood and other, like times that I had an easier time remembering something or harder, it could be really difficult to tell someone, oh yes, those things were always together or always apart. So that's why a lot of times you'll see people bounce between these diagnoses, and they do have different treatments and different outcomes. So that can be important to consider, again, when you're looking at literature, and you may see some of these all lumped together, and I want you to kind of remember, oh, there may actually be important differences there. And then I also added bipolar disorder. I kind of took this table from an article. I wanted to add bipolar disorder with psychotic symptoms onto it because that is just another close step away from schizoaffective. Sometimes those psychotic features are very brief, but sometimes it's hard to know exactly how brief they are, especially in just a 1-hour interview. So I wanted to kind of throw this on to the spectrum, and I suspect in the future versions of the DSM-5, we're going to be seeing more focus on the individual differences in symptoms and treating the individual versus just kind of putting this label on for almost health insurance purposes. So another way that we can look at mental health and mental health disorders is the research domain criteria framework. Has anyone heard of this before? I wasn't sure if this would be, okay, a couple people have seen it. So this is a really big deal right now in the National Institute of Mental Health. It is one of the reasons that my project got funded, is that in addition to the diagnostic criteria that we kind of have to use for historical reasons, and they are helpful in some ways, we also want to take this approach of viewing everything that could be involved with this disorder. So at the top, you'll see the lifespan and development component. And again, schizophrenia is a developmental disorder, and so it's important to consider the time in life that the symptoms started arising and how the trajectory of that disorder may change that person's life. And then, so on the domains on the left-hand side, you can see a few different domains. I focus on the positive valence domain, so you can kind of note that, and the cognitive domain. Those are the two that I'll be mostly talking about today, but this framework covers a bunch of other domains. It also considers the environment, and so that's kind of those social determinants of health that I was mentioning. And then the units of analysis is kind of this idea of measuring all of these things, coming up with objective measurements for these symptoms, for the development, for the social determinants. Because if we have really good measures, we can better understand that individual's experience and how treatment is affecting them. So I am a really big fan of this framework, and it really informs the way that I think about a lot of my research. So I wanted to share that with everyone. So how do we define schizophrenia and schizophrenia spectrum disorders? You can use the DSM-5 criteria, which is helpful especially if you need to do inclusion and exclusion in research, but maybe not as helpful when it comes to treating the person and getting to know how the disorder is affecting them. And that's where the RDoC framework comes in. You can characterize the symptoms and get a better idea of how that person can uniquely be helped. So next we'll talk a little bit about the genetic and environmental factors. So I wanted to just bring up this Hidden Valley Road book. Someone introduced me to this book right at the beginning of when I was studying schizophrenia, and I just couldn't put it down. I thought it was an excellent read. I think it's especially cool because it takes place in Colorado Springs, starting in the 1950s. So you get a little bit of Colorado history, but more importantly, the history of schizophrenia and schizophrenia treatment, because a lot of the way that we think about schizophrenia was kind of born around this time in the 50s. There were some ideas of how it might have been developed, and those ideas started to change throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then the book takes you all the way up through the early 2000s and actually ends with a researcher in the department where I collaborate at Anschutz. So it's kind of close to home. And it's a really fascinating book because, as you can see on the cover, I think this is 10 of the 12 children. So this family has 12 children, and most of them, but not all, develop schizophrenia or schizoaffective. And so that really was helpful in the early days of studying the genetics of schizophrenia, having one whole family where you could look at who did and who didn't develop it. And then they continued even on through the next generation. They continued participating in research. And it was really amazing because at that time, they found that there are genes linked to schizophrenia. And so, when genes started, when we started to be able to study genes, that was the answer to everything. Like, if we can find the gene associated, then we can really help treat and help identify people who are at risk for this disorder. As we know, as you may remember from your textbook, it turns out that it's not quite that simple. Schizophrenia is polygenic, which means it takes a bunch of different genes interacting, and even with all of those genes, you still may not develop schizophrenia. So that can be kind of the silver lining, is that there are things that even the children of this family and their children were able to do to prevent the risk and the development of mental health disorders. And so the one thing that is in common with all these genes that's important to know is that they are involved with development. And so that really helps inform our idea that this is a developmental disorder. In the early days of schizophrenia, it was thought of almost more as dementia. And so that can help us learn more about all developmental disorders when we view them like that. And then the genes associated with schizophrenia are also associated with these other developmental disorders, which is interesting because it helps us kind of categorize this set of symptoms, but it's really difficult because two people with similar genetic profiles may have completely different symptoms and developmental disorders in the end. So that's definitely an interesting line of research that gets really complicated really fast. So I just wanted to touch on it briefly. The other component is these environmental factors. And one of the things that I learned through this project that I'm working on with the social determinants is that really childhood trauma, substance abuse, and other proxies of stress are interacting with these genetic risk factors and then ultimately resulting in these kinds of symptoms. In psychosis generally, really those are the top most important environmental factors. And one of the things that I've learned too is that it's important to look at how we are measuring these. especially childhood trauma if you're asking retrospectively, and especially if you're asking in a situation where that person may feel uncomfortable. One of the things that has been shown in research is that that data may not be as reliable as something where a person was able to self-report through a computer or a written response where they don't feel that social pressure. So just another thing as you're evaluating literature in your future to kind of take a look at how are we measuring these environmental factors, and is that really the best way to assess the stress that is ultimately inducing or affecting these disorders. So now you know a little bit about the genetic and environmental factors, like the fact that it's polygenic, and that early trauma and other stressors are really important factors in the development of this disorder. So now we'll talk a little bit more about motivation and reward processing. And some of the reasons that I picked to focus on this, not only because it's part of my own research, but because then in your next lecture, you're going to learn a little bit more about reward processing and motivation and emotion. And so I thought it would be a nice preview. And then it's also thought in schizophrenia that motivation is really strongly linked to cognition. So I'll explain that a little bit more in a second. But why would we care so much about these cognitive symptoms? Often in literature and in popular media, it's focused on the positive and negative symptoms, the hallucinations and delusions, and the catatonia. And you could even consider the negative symptoms as being kind of related to motivation. A lot of times that avolition or anhedonia of not wanting to perform activities and not taking pleasure in activities are really highly implicated in schizophrenia. And so why focus on these cognitive symptoms? Because some research has actually shown that it is these cognitive symptoms that are most closely linked to quality of life outcomes. And so as we kind of move forward in this idea of how to treat individuals and bring forth the best quality of life versus just curing their illness, which we know is not a very reasonable expectation, it becomes more important to look at these cognitive factors, because if someone can learn to cope with some of the other symptoms, the cognitive factors are what will help them, keep a job and provide for themselves and shop for their own food and really have independence in life. And so that's why I'm going to focus on motivation as it relates to cognition. I think it's really important when it comes to the outcomes of the person's life, and I think it'll be a really strong line of research in the future. And it's what I know most about. So here, I just want you to focus on two main areas that I kind of highlighted. So on the left-hand side, this is kind of how we think of a neurotypical set of networks. On one side, you have all these brain areas that you remember from cognition. Hippocampus. I think everyone knows at this point that HM helped us learn that the hippocampus is strongly involved with memory and cognition. So that's the one I want you to focus on the left. And then on the right-hand side, we have this reward motivation set of circuits. And the one I want you to focus on there is nucleus accumbens, partly because that's the one that is most related to what I'm about to talk about, but also because I think you kind of are more familiar with some of these other areas, amygdala, ventral tegmental area. So those are also involved in reward and motivation, but let's focus on the nucleus accumbens. And so here you can see that the hippocampus is connected to these other brain areas, resulting in cognition, in neurotypical or normal cognition, healthy cognition. And then on the other side, you kind of have reward and motivation stuff separate. It's doing its own thing and not really interacting with cognition. But we know that there are dopaminergic and glutamatergic projections from these reward and motivation areas to these cognition areas. And so what we think is that specifically in schizophrenia, this interaction between reward and motivation areas and cognition areas becomes super important and ultimately creates this sort of feedback loop. That's why these arrows are going between the two sections now, So now you can see that the hippocampus is actually connected to the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is connected to all these other areas in cognition. And so it's not these two separate domains. They're actually feeding forward and feeding back onto each other. And in a way, this makes a lot of sense. I can even see it in any cognitive testing I do. If someone is trying really hard at the test, they are more likely to do a little better. And if someone really doesn't care, they're totally disengaged, they're not even looking at the instructions, they're going to tend to perform a little worse on that cognitive test. And if you imagine this extrapolated out into all the things that you're doing in life, the more motivated and rewarding you find learning and cognition, the more you're going to continue to do it, and it's going to feed forward like that. And so if you have an issue in an area like the nucleus accumbens, and it kind of puts a stop to that and interferes with your ability to perform cognitive tasks, then you can see where that might be a really important interruption and potentially a place that we can address. Did you have a question?
Yeah. For this kind of divergent pathways, it always externalized behavior.
So the question is this always externalized behaviorally? In this theory, the paper that this all comes from, they looked at both cognitive tests in humans as well as functional and brain data from animal experiments. And so all of that is behavioral. That's just what kind of the foundation of this theory is. I can't necessarily speak to other more subconscious kind of outcomes of this type of theory, but that would definitely be interesting to look into. And part of the reason that it is behavioral is because that's a lot easier to measure. So we'll talk about measurements in just a second. And I think the idea here is that since it can be so difficult to diagnose and address schizophrenia, and there are these uncontrollable factors like genetics and environmental factors that can influence it, perhaps this kind of theory can help us find an area that we can help influence to provide better outcomes. And so if we can maybe assist with this feedback loop and help it to create stronger cognition, then hopefully that would lead to better outcomes. So that's why we're kind of looking at that. And so just one more mention on this topic is how are we measuring the brain and behavioral aspects of this theory. And so one of the ways we do that is with a cognitive task. This is called the effort expenditure for reward task. And if you know me, you'll know I'm obsessed with this task. It's one of the tasks that when I first started in my research lab, I was asked to actually develop a new version of it. And for me, coding on a computer and designing a task was totally new and something I never thought I would do. So I just really challenged myself and took it on and ended up really falling in love. And I'm continuing to adjust this task. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the task. And I just want you to remember, too, that even though this is just one specific task, and I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail, there are lots of cognitive tasks out there that we use. And whenever you're learning about a new theory about schizophrenia or anything, these are the kinds of measurements that we're typically using, and it's important to look at these measurements, make sure that they're actually measuring the thing that you want to be measuring before you make kind of grand theories or interpret these results. So this task is kind of fun. It's one of the most fun ones. We do 7 tasks in my research study visits, and this is one of the ones that people tend to like the best. So we call it Pop the Balloon because we thought effort expenditure for reward task was not as fun for the participants. In my version, we use points, but in the original version developed in 2009, they use money as the reward. And so one of my questions moving forward is about whether money and points are kind of viewed equally. Are you willing to expend the same amount of effort for both? I don't have answers to that yet. I just wanted to tell you it's kind of cool. And so what you do in this task is you're faced with this screen that shows you the reward for an easy trial, the reward for a hard trial, and then the probability that you will win that reward if you complete the trial. And so say I select easy, I would have to press the space bar 25 times in 7 seconds, which is still pretty fast. It's a little bit of effort. And then if I pop the balloon, in this case, I would have a 12% chance to win that reward. And then we use different probability levels, so 12, 50, and 80%. And then we use different reward levels as well. So easy is always 100, and hard is always more. In my task, it goes up to 800. In the original version, it goes up to $4. And so it's this kind of measurement of how many times does a person choose the hard task over the easy task. And then you can look at this in some different ways. You can look at just the overall score. How willing are they to just expend effort, press that button as much as possible, regardless of reward or probability. That's one measure of effort or motivation that you'll see. And then another thing we do too is kind of break it up. At high reward levels, who is most likely to be picking the hard trials? And that's where really interesting differences come in with schizophrenia. It tends to be at the high reward trials where healthy controls will pick more hard conditions and people with schizophrenia will pick less. But up to that point, they're often the same. And so there is really something going on with this reward valuation and this motivation, and that's what this task can help us see. So you might expect that one of those brain areas that I just showed would be related to this task. So why are we focusing on motivation and reward processing? This theory of synergistic networks kind of helps us understand that motivation can have impacts on cognition, and that might be a really useful way, if we can measure it well, to maybe address those issues. And so let's dive into the brain areas. So this is a study that used the effort expenditure for reward task, or the effort task. And they did find that the nucleus accumbens was one of the areas that was most different between healthy controls and participants with schizophrenia. And I've been really looking into this task a lot, and it is used in comparisons between people with schizophrenia and all different types of schizophrenia spectrum disorders. So in this case, we're comparing to healthy controls, but this task is really useful in figuring out where different disorders have interactions with motivation. And so on the left, you can see just the little lit up area of the nucleus accumbens. That's the NACC, is what that stands for. And so it was more active in participants with, so it had a stronger trend in healthy controls and then not participants with schizophrenia. And so I'll explain that using these graphs on the right-hand side. So I know it's a little hard to see, but on the x-axis, you have the healthy controls on the left and people with schizophrenia on the right, and then brain activity on the y-axis. And so if you look at the black bar on the A graph, that is going to be for a low reward, and then the white bar is for a high reward. And so that's the different rewards that were given for the hard trial. So in the example I showed you, a reward of like 100 for the easy and 150 for the hard, that would be the low. And then if I had a 800 for the hard, that would be a high. And so it kind of makes sense in the healthy controls. You can see that for the high reward, there's more activity. Pretty strong pattern there. However, in participants with schizophrenia, you actually have a little bit of decreased activity at both levels. And so that suggests that something about this reward valuation is not the same between these two groups. And then in the B, you can see the black bar is the lowest probability, and then the white bar is the medium probability. The gray is the highest probability of receiving that reward. And so it would make sense in healthy controls, the higher probability, the more times they chose hard, and the more brain activity. However, that pattern does not hold up for people with schizophrenia. Their nucleus accumbens is not having these same kind of responses to reward and to probability. And so that has led researchers to think that there is something really important going on with this nucleus accumbens, which is so connected to all these other areas too that we know can be involved with cognition. And so now that we know the nucleus accumbens is involved, what can we do about it? And so one really cool article that I found is about fMRI feedback training. And so essentially they had participants in the MRI and let's see, you can kind of see on the right-hand side. So participants in the MRI, they had this region of interest of the nucleus accumbens. They would teach participants to increase and decrease that activity with a separate task. And then they had them do the effort task before and after this experience. And so what happened in this study, it was just with healthy controls, but 74% of healthy controls learned to regulate the activity of their nucleus accumbens. So that was kind of new information. This is a technique that has not been used very much, and it's really cool because it doesn't involve medication and it's non-invasive, but it is really expensive. Obviously, fMRI isn't super accessible to everyone, so there's pros and cons to this approach. Learning to regulate activity was also associated with improved performance on the effort and decreased connectivity between the nucleus accumbens and ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which was another area in that diagram. And so maybe if we kind of reduce that connectivity, train the nucleus accumbens, perhaps we can alter that cycle of motivation and cognition. And so that is the brain areas that at least are associated with motivation deficits and schizophrenia. And then you may see those areas come up again as you're learning more about motivation and emotion. The nucleus accumbens is the one that I focused on, but that same article also found similar changes in the pattern of activity in the posterior cingulate gyrus. So I just wanted to throw that up at you too. And so I did leave a little extra time for questions. That way, if you have any questions about schizophrenia or schizophrenia spectrum or my experience researching, or just more general questions about going into research and grad school, or maybe if you're not planning on research or grad school, how this might apply to you, I'm happy to answer any kinds of questions like that as well.
I read this study. I don't really know how serious they should take it. There was a lot of intersection between creativity, trade openness, and schizophrenia that they were trying to filter. I was wondering if you guys looked into that in your
That's a great question. So you're asking about other personality traits and things that could be confounding or influencing this whole relationship. That's a good question. I would say we do look at it a little bit, but not as much as I would like. Our study visits are about 4 hours long on the first day and about 3.5 hours long on the second day. And so we pack a lot in there. Since my focus is kind of these social determinants, that got a lot more time in the measurements. And so we have a lot more measurements of socioeconomic status and these external factors, not as many of personality. But we do, I'm trying to think of how we do incorporate that. We do measure other domains of cognition, but maybe not specifically that one. So that would be a really interesting addition if we could just have 1/3 visit to get a little more into personality types. And even I think treatment history kind of goes along with that as well. So great ideas. I will use those in my future. Mm-hmm.
Curious, so I feel like one of the kind of like age-old questions with schizophrenia is the concept of achieving in the age, whether schizophrenia causes poverty or poverty causes schizophrenia. And I feel like obviously it's kind of one of those things that's culture, it's a two-way street. But do you think this would kind of indicate towards early factors in schizophrenia determining, like increasing that possibility of the cognitive poverty just because they tend to make those decisions less frequently than in work or at home?
That's a really good question. So the question is about the chicken and egg situation that is something like poverty an outcome or a cause. And it is just a huge field of debate. There are some people that will absolutely say it should be viewed as an outcome. And as you said, it's a two-way street, right? You have to acknowledge that it becomes this sort of cycle. But I would say that if we approach it as an outcome, it will lead to better things like policy changes and just the better approaches to addressing it. When you view it as a cause, yes, you want to try, I mean, prevention is always the best medicine, of course, but when you view it in that way, sometimes it's like, well, it's already caused, it's too late. And so I think too, if you spoke to more developmental researchers, they may fall more on that side because that is more an area that then they can address during the development, or sometimes they'll even study people at high risk for schizophrenia or people experiencing psychosis symptoms without all of the rest of the schizophrenia symptoms. And oftentimes they'll find different patterns of either brain activity or performance. And so I think the more that we can dig into this and really measure it well, the better we'll be able to understand where are those points that we can actually address. Because they have to be there somewhere, right? So that's a great question. And it continues to be a source of debate. And even, I'm thinking about this social determinants of health article. One of the senior researchers that I work with on it has no problem saying, oh, it's a cause of schizophrenia, all of this, that's how we should view it. And so maybe it takes someone who has been in the field for 30 years to then feel more confident about the side that they fall on. But it is absolutely a two-way street, and just getting to speak with the individuals and hearing their life stories and really seeing that play out. I mean, especially when you incorporate the heritability and genetic factors. So many of these people tell me stories of their parents with schizophrenia and the trauma that they experienced from that, and then how that was incorporated into the expression of their illness. And so it does become really complicated, but I think important to continue developing the measures, because the better we can measure and the better we know what's going on in the brain, the more we can delineate between how we can help different individuals that might be experiencing these things and reacting differently. Good question.
What are some of the environmental, social determinant trends that you see? Just what does that look like?
Great question. So the question is about what are some of the trends in environmental social determinants. And I will say largely the biggest trend is that we're starting to view everything environmental as social determinants, whether it's exposure to cannabis, whether it's, it's not just your typical childhood trauma where you physically or sexually abused, which is kind of how it started. And so that's where a lot of the research is strongest, because those are the easier questions to ask. You can even use things like police records to determine that. And so I think the cool trend is that we're now branching out away from that and viewing more things like what is your environment, things like urbanicity, how urban your environment is. And then we're also viewing these things not as necessarily just, again, boxes oh, an urban environment, bad. But it's these qualities that we're measuring as urbanicity as a proxy of those qualities, and then trying to figure out how those are all entangled. So is it more about population density? Is it more about access to resources? Is it all of these other things associated with that? And so I think one of the large trends is that we're starting to measure more of those subdomains and really getting at the interactions there. Another trend in social determinants, one of the hardest things in writing that article was picking which ones to focus on. And so we picked 9, and then our co-authors came up with about 30 others that we should consider. And so I love that, because I think it really suggests we're looking at everything more holistically. But I hate it because it made the article really long and hard to write. And so some of the other social determinants that we focused on, besides early childhood adversity, socioeconomic status, and urbanicity, which I've kind of discussed a little bit, we also mentioned migration status. And so in certain countries, when there is a huge influx of migrants, especially refugees, there also tends to be increased use of resources, mental health resources, and kind of figuring out not just the prevalence of different mental health disorders among populations that are maybe migrants or refugees, but then why? What is the stress that they're experiencing socially that is actually leading to that? And so that's something I really saw across the timeline of the literature, is that after just figuring out the prevalence, we're now asking why? What is the stress going on? How can we address the stress and make sure that people have access to the resources at an early stage? And so that was another pretty cool trend.
Do you see anything with like relationships or like like interpersonal?
Absolutely. So communication styles and social networks are another domain that we focus on. And so what has been done a lot in the past is just asking people, how many people do you interact with? Who are your friends? Some studies go as far as asking about the quality of these relationships. And just now, we're just beginning to start asking about what are your communication styles and how is that interacting with that whole network? And how can we address this communication style, which maybe can be adjusted and taught a little better to help those social supports, and maybe, like I said, maybe improve quality of life without really improving the symptoms necessarily. But yeah, that's a great point. Social networks and social relationships are definitely a social determinant.
Is there any like pattern there of like styles that you've seen, or is it just super dependent on the person and their?
So far, the main pattern is people like on the spectrum of schizophrenia disorders tend to have early social isolation. And then it kind of creates this chicken and egg thing again of, they're socially isolated, and then they just kind of develop in this way without the social supports, and it can be really hard to then, then oftentimes in a psychiatric facility, that's the time that they are now kind of forced into these relationships, and figuring out how to navigate that space can be especially difficult. And that even comes back to your question about personality traits. One of the biggest debates we had at the beginning of this article was whether to consider social withdrawal a social determinant or a personality factor. And it is not really resolved yet, because as you can imagine, in one way you can look at it as a personality factor. You're withdrawn. It's not about your access to a social network, but it's your style to be withdrawn. But on the other hand, when you're suffering from a lot of these other risk factors for schizophrenia spectrum disorders, is the social withdrawal in fact an outcome? And so it gets really nitty-gritty in the measurements, and we kind of just made a choice that when the measurement used asks questions about you and your style, we're considering that not a social determinant. When the measurement asks questions about your access to people, the kinds of groups that you can participate in, what kind of living situation you have, then we consider that more social determinant. So it gets really tricky to measure.
Yeah, cool.
I was kind of tacked onto it anyway, but I was going to ask if you thought a lot of the reading that I found, particularly on schizoaffective disorders, kind of stuck between the chief reason for it being inherited or isolation. So you kind of don't know for a second. I was wondering if you saw one of those two kind of playing out.
I think the trickiest thing, especially with schizoaffective, is because it's so rarely studied in isolation, and it's almost impossible to do so for all those reasons that it's really difficult to diagnose. And so I think that I don't have a great answer to your question, but I think that in the future, the way that we could answer that is by developing better measures for all of each individual piece and bringing them together versus just viewing these things kind of in isolation.